So this is a paper that was published in a journal called Animal Welfare. And so you get the details of that later. So I'm going to try to summarize some of that work that was done. So this is really trying to understand some of the ways that rodents are managed in the UK. So we've really tried to focus just on the UK and the issues there. Most of the people who were involved were from the UK. As I'm sure you're all aware, the UK probably has the best reputation in the world for animal welfare. And I think in the context of this talk, I don't need to go into that a lot, but as a foreigner coming here, I thought it was amazing how much regard was taken for animal welfare, and that seems to be ratcheted up quite recently. Changes to the law, the banning of glue traps, which I'm sure is affecting some of you here, and there are just so many sort of charitable foundations that are all around protecting the rights of animals. And so I think that's kind of the context of what's going on, I think, in the greater scheme of things. I think this welfare issue is going to become a bigger issue. It's being driven by a lot of policy at the European level, but also here in the UK. I think they're trying to lead the way to try to improve welfare regard. At the moment, I suspect a lot of you, it's something in your minds, but you probably aren't doing a lot about it necessarily in your daily practice. But I think that's probably going to change moving forward. Okay. So in my work, I work a lot in Africa and Asia, and when I talk to people out there, animal welfare is just not on the agenda at all. This is a guy I met earlier this year in Tanzania, and when he was a child, he was bitten by a rat on his foot, which became gangrenous, and you can see the result there. He had some amputations, but he never really recovered from it, so now he goes around with a cane to walk around. And I meet a lot of people like this. I meet a lot of families where the kids are afraid to go to sleep at night because they do get bitten by rats. And so it's a real sort of difference from the situation here. And in places like this, people often want to kill the rats in the worst way possible. They just, they stomp on them, they do all sorts of things, and I think in that sort of context, they actually are really trying hard sometimes to be cruel because of the impact that these rats have had on their lives. So I think we're always going to have to balance these sort of issues. I think with particularly rodent management, there is this sort of context, and a lot of people, they're afraid of them, and they're often not thinking about welfare when it comes to trying to control rats. So we really focused on what was registered in the UK. Of course, there's lots of other products out there, but we sort of had these broad categories of things that were being mainly used or being introduced. So, of course, different kinds of traps, live traps, snap traps, also the glue traps, anticoagulants, calciferol products, and even this sort of alpha cellulose stuff that seems to be used more. So just to sort of a breakdown of the people who are involved, you can see most people were from the United Kingdom that were on this panel of experts. But we did have some representation from Australia, New Zealand, Germany, people who had already been involved in similar sorts of evaluations of products in their own countries, so it was useful to have them. And then the sort of expertise background was quite varied. There were some sort of key welfare people who were on this panel and driving it. So some of you may have come across the name Sandra Baker. She works at the University of Oxford. She was a sort of a lead person on this. She does a lot of animal welfare things that you may have come across. So one of the things, because this was a panel of experts that were doing it, one of the things we had to first agree on is what was our sort of confidence in the assessments that we were trying to do on these products and the way they were being used. So in some cases, there would be a lot of evidence out there. We could say, yes, indeed, we're really highly agreed, have a high confidence in the statements that we're making. Other times there's less data there. So that was part of our assessment, is that we all had to have a level of confidence in the assessments that we were making. So this is a sort of the strategy of how welfare is broken down, in not just for rodents, but it has been used in the context of a lot of other animals as well, trying to understand. So it's sort of broken down into these 5 domains. So we have the first 4 domains there, which are very much sort of easy to assess. These are sort of physical things. So, domain 1 is about water, food deprivation possibly affecting. Then we have things like environmental challenges. So, for example, changing the habitat, putting in traps even could be some sort of environmental change. diseases, injury that might be caused because of management issues, and then things that might affect behavior and their foraging behavior. And that all leads down to mental components, which seems a bit silly, of course. How can we actually assess that? And we agree you can't actually assess those things. I mean, we don't have evidence usually there. But, so we're anthropomorphizing there to some extent. But I think, we understand that when we're doing it. But often what is happening in that is those mental issues are sort of the highest, whatever comes out highest on these other domains, we would say that's probably going to have some sort of impact on the feeling or pain of that animal. So there are two components to the way this works. So the first one, which we refer to as Part A, is really related to the implementation of whatever management it is. So that's like putting out traps, putting out poisons, whatever you're doing. What sort of impact does that have itself on some sort of welfare? So that can be over time. So it can be something that happens very quick. So if it's a kill trap and the rat comes along and gets killed, that's one thing. But this is actually before that actually being killed. So this is about putting out the traps themselves or putting out rodenticides. So it's what happens before the actual killing actually occurs. So that's what Part B is about. So this is about the time when the animal is actually being killed. So this is usually, if you come along a rat in a live trap, you would have to take the rat out and whack it over the head. So how long does that take, that period of actually taking it out and whacking it on the head? Is probably just a few minutes. So that's where these scales come from. So that for that example, you would say it's minutes, and it would be a pretty mild impact in that sense because there's not a long time of suffering there. So we have this Part A and this Part B, and so for everything, so whether it was rodenticides, traps, live traps, kill traps, etc., we went through and did all those kinds of rankings. And then we plotted them against each other. So on this graph over here, we have Part B along the bottom, which is the killing method itself, and then Part A, which is the impact of the actual activity in itself. So as this is coming up, we had to make some assumptions on how these activities were done and that people followed best practice. So of course you could put out traps in the wrong way or the kinds of traps, et cetera, et cetera. So when we were talking about live trapping, of course, the best practice is you get the rat out and you hit it immediately. Not everyone might do that, but we had to make those kind of assumptions that people were going by what were recommended. The same thing for using glue traps, that you would be checking those regularly and again hitting them over the head. So that poisoning, we either had scenarios where you were pre-baiting or not baiting. And then the same thing, what we were recognizing with a lot of kill traps is quite a lot of variation in design and the way they work and how efficient they are, but also that might have welfare implications itself. So when you look over here, for example, this long stretched out oval 1, that is related to snap trapping. So what that's trying to imply is that particularly with the Part B killing method, some of them might be very, very efficient and not lead to very much suffering. So that's why you could say Part B-A, those sort of traps were probably quite effective, but the other traps might lead to quite long-term suffering. It might take maybe 24 hours for the rat to actually die when it's caught, or perhaps even longer. So that's what these bars are trying to show. So down this way, those methods have better welfare. Anything that's up that way has worse welfare based on looking at Part A and Part B together. So what you see, cage trapping here is kind of in the middle in terms of, again, how much suffering might occur there. And then glue trapping, which is number 3, which was way up here in terms of that there is a potential for quite a longer period of suffering. And then all the sort of poisons are the same that were over here. So they were considered physiologically could result in quite a lot of suffering once the animals eat it. So you may agree or disagree with that, but that was what we came up with in terms of trying to assess these different methods. So I think it's something to bear in mind that probably policymakers, they are talking about this in a number of EU countries now, that this is going to become more important in terms of regulating products that are available. Glue traps, as you know, have been banned here. They've already been banned in a lot of other parts of the world. And as I'm sure you're all aware, a lot of rodenticide methods are being taken away, often for environmental impacts, but not always. A lot of times there is a lot of welfare issues involved in that too. So, that's another thing we're going to have to think about. I mean, you probably are aware the Netherlands is really having pretty much an almost entire ban on the use of anticoagulants starting next year. Pest control officers and technicians will still have those products available, but they're going to have to make a very special case on a case-by-case basis. So they can't just go out and use them anyway. And so there's a lot of panic in the Netherlands, particularly by the livestock industry there. What are we going to do? Farmers themselves won't be able to buy poisons or do anything themselves. They will have to get a professional in. But even those professionals, their first port of call will not be poisons. They'll have to do other things and make special justifications. So I fear that is probably going to become widespread across the EU. What the UK does, of course, now that we're not part of the EU, may be different, but I can't see the UK not following through with some of these aspects, considering other places are doing it. So it's something to be aware of, that this might become a bigger challenge for you all going forward. So in terms of traps, I think, or any sort of method, one thing we always seem to forget about is, what is the real impact of rats on people's lives? I see that a lot in my work in overseas countries where people, again, they just don't think about the humaneness or the welfare because they're more worried about the impact on their own lives. And I think this does get lost in the discussion, and it'd be interesting to see what you all think about that we're talking about issues that, if we don't control rats, then what's the problem? So we've got to think about that. So those are just videos I got off YouTube, actually, about these fen traps. I'm sure some of you are familiar with these fen traps, just showing that it can take quite a long time for rats to die in certain kinds of traps. I've used these traps myself. I think they work really well, but they can not always kill quite immediately. So that's the paper. You might recognize some of the names there. So Alan Buckle, Dave Cowan, people that are pretty well regarded in the pest control industry were involved in this, as well as some other people that you may not recognize. But there's a link there. It's freely available online if you want to find out more about how it was all done and what are the implications of that. This is not, of course, policy. This is just a study that possibly will inform the way things go forward in the future. There are other studies that are being planned, particularly on trapping, for example, trying to assess different traps and how good they are. I know there's been some of that in the past, but to do a much more systematic assessment of different kinds of kill traps, particularly to try to see what are the best in terms of efficacy, but also in terms of welfare impact, how good they are. And so with that, I can take any questions you might have on that. Are you all absolutely shocked by having to take account welfare? I'm sure, does everyone here already think about welfare when they're doing rodent control? I'm sure you do.
I think you have to, because the customers themselves are thinking about it straight away.
Yeah.
It's a question we all get asked.
Yeah.
Are you going to kill it? Will it suffer?
Yeah.
We don't want it to suffer either. I'm sure there's some out there that do, but the majority of us just the problem dealt with.
Yeah. No, a lot of public, of course, they don't even want the animal killed. They want you to release it somewhere else.
Pest control is an incredibly emotive subject, no matter what you're talking about. But certainly when it comes to trapping, it's a big problem for the public. But as you say, they still want to kill.
Yeah. So I think that there needs to be some sort of awareness raising, I think, on the negative impacts sometimes of rodents. People don't necessarily think about all the diseases that are possibly transmitted, the other sort of economic impacts and things like that.
That's for pest management to educate the customers on that. Yeah. If you don't educate your customers, you can't expect them to understand it. But equally, some customers want the problem solved without you doing certain things. Which is like fighting Mike Tyson with one arm. It's not going to happen.
Can one assume from the data that no means is humane?
Sorry?
Can one assume from the data then that no means of control is humane?
Well, we started to talk about other things like, for example, predators and other things that are out there that we're not in charge of. Is that humane? If you think about the way a bird of prey comes down and eats a rodent, if we're trying to, put ourselves in that sort of position, we would probably say, well, that's pretty cruel and unusual too. But, where do you stop with these things?
In as far as if a member of the public were to say to you, what is a humane way of control? What would
if it was me talking about humaneness, I would say that in itself, not doing anything doesn't absolve you of responsibility, I think, for problems. So particularly when you have severe impacts on people, but even on the rodents themselves, if you have high density populations, they're all under stress. So you could argue that, just letting nature take its course isn't necessarily good for your conscience either. So, but this is it. It's a very slippery slope. Then how far do you go, and how far is human responsibility for what goes on in the wild? And some people will go to quite extremes and saying, "Oh, we're responsible for it all, even if we do nothing," in that sense. So yeah, I mean, this is just a bit of evidence, and I think what we would like to do is to try to make it a much more evidence-based approach as opposed to emotion, and trying to say, okay, these are the things. Some of these things probably have more impact on welfare than others, but we still have to think about, well, we can't just all do live trapping and kill trapping. It's far too costly to do that. But maybe that's what will happen, is that these poisons and things will be removed, and we're going to have to spend a lot more money to make it meet our standards. So this kind of relates to my next talk, where, again, I think the things that we're doing actually are making things more expensive, but that's what people want. So
I think there's a value in comparing the stress the rodent goes under from a raptor kill to a trap, and if it's sort of comparable, it might have some sort of...
They have done that in some countries, actually. Australia spent a lot of time on this because they have these big mouse plagues, and they've talked about what are the best ways of killing in a much broader context than that. And there have actually been some lab studies. If you go to CSIRO and you look at some of the things they've done, they've actually tried to, in laboratory settings, which they wouldn't be allowed to do this anymore, but they actually were inflicting pain on rodents through different mechanisms and trying to assess that in a very physiological way. That's going back decades now. If they tried to do that, it wouldn't even be allowed. But they were, again, you think of the way a snake kills a rodent, strangulation, is that any different from just stepping on it or squeezing it with your hands? It's not. So, but a lot of times people I've been told by some panels, no, you can't do that. You have to use CO2 and all these other things in a more research way. So it's really difficult, but I think there are ways of doing it if we were allowed to do it now, but I don't think we'll be able to do those kind of studies anymore.
Even within using traps, that you still could subdivide further. I mean, if you've got a way of funneling them in so that it always kills them, that's got to be more humane than a trap that has a risk of catching a leg or something like that.
Yeah, no, I entirely agree. But no one has yet done those kinds of assessments. I think those could be done to try to see what are the best traps. But also, when I start thinking about how do you get the rat out of the trap, if it's a cage trap, you've really got to shake it sometimes to get it out. And one of the things that I've been arguing, which no one will probably agree, but as a researcher, I have halothane and things I can put in there, put the animal to sleep, and then get it out of the trap much more effectively. You guys don't have access to those compounds, which I think, why, if you're really worried about welfare of animals and you were live trapping, that would be the best way. You just put them to sleep and then you can break their necks afterwards or whatever. But, that would require a big change in access to materials and tools, really. So, yes.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously under the Animal Welfare Act, we've all got a responsibility on our actions and its impact on the work we're carrying out, which is controlling pests. But our job is to carry out our actions, but to minimise suffering as much as possible.
Yeah.
Even proofing or denying food or harbourage will cause an animal suffering.
I agree. It's coming back to this question of doing nothing in a sense, or just trying to improve sanitation and hygiene. It all has an impact. So
it's just our job to sort of obviously carry out control. Public health.
But what I worry is that people are increasingly be telling you this is what you must do, even if it's not necessarily rational, because it's all just based, if you just think of so much that's gone on in pesticide regulation, whether it's impacting bees or whatever, sometimes the evidence just isn't part of the discussion at all. So it's just trying to move the conversation that way to help us, in a sense, to do this. And, and this is it, we need to have the common sense aspect to this. We're trying to control something that does have a big impact on our lives, even if the people who are got the problem don't realize it, I think. So.
And again, it's about education, as
Yeah.
my friend said here.
And that's another thing that's very much lacking, I think, in the
Because
public.
you can't re-release these pests, and
No.
even that would cause additional suffering.
Absolutely, I agree.
So,
But that's still what people want to do.
well, then they're causing suffering, aren't they?
Yeah. I guess we need to be more blunt sometimes with people. You know, releasing them is irresponsible. You're just giving it the problem to someone else in that sense. So.
As laudable as this all is, I have concerns, like everyone, especially if you work in the country or you enjoy countryside sports, that this research is being misused, and there's potential for it being misused. Anthropomorphism is rife, and what are they going to do to actually get around that? Now, we are all pest controllers. You're leaning against an open door that we want to do the job humanely as possible.
Yeah.
And by and large, sometimes we're not given the opportunity to do that because a customer expects you to do a certain thing, and you try as much as you like to tell them they can't do that, but they still expect it. But it's been hijacked. Hijacked for political reasons, hijacked for reasons of they don't like it anyway. So that research, to me, although it's good, it shows a few things. It's open to misinterpretation and will be, and already has been.
Of course, I agree, and I don't have the answer for that really. What I would suggest is that if you look at all the methods that are currently available, they all have similar problems. You know, I mean, you might be able to say trapping is maybe a little bit better than poisoning, but for the most part, there isn't a big difference there. So, I mean, we have to, I guess, as a pest control industry, start to take charge of this and make sure that...
They're moving that now to external wildlife control, not just rats, everything. So you're not allowed to go into the country to control anything. Even
Once you're off farm, it's a totally
detrimental
different thing. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
So it's a good idea, but poorly thought through. It certainly hasn't been pushed to its extremes to make people understand this is why these things need doing.
Yeah.
And that is going to be, it's going to decimate not so much the industry itself, but it's going to make it very, very expensive. Customers will not want to pay those bills, so they're going to go to the dodgy options. As long as you don't see it or do we need to.
Yeah. No, I entirely agree with you. But this is to not do this kind of work, at least, I think, even though it can be misused, if we did nothing and weren't able to come up with any evidence at all.
I'm not disagreeing with you, but it's already been misused. Unfortunately, we've got rid of
I agree.
tasks.
And I think that it is a very UK thing too. The awareness of animal rights and welfare is very high here. And there's so much money going into it. You've got all these charitable foundations. That was just a very short list.
Businesses, so they can use it to raise more funds. They're a business.
Yeah,
they're no more worried about animal welfare. They are very.
You get all these you get these websites with these poor little suffering puppies and everything out there. And I sympathize with it, but at the same time, we're losing sight of the real impact of rodents. And I think that's what we need to try to fight more for, is that, and showing some of the real impacts, and that, this isn't just a one-sided argument.